You might already know who I am or may have heard about my case on the news or online. It was all over the place for a little while. I was internet famous at one point. Lots of people wrote stories about me and my family, and they all have their own opinions, but I'm the only person that knows what truly happened. I'm not telling you this story because I want your sympathy, or even that I want to convince you that it's true. I'm telling you this as a warning, in hopes that you or a family member won't end up like my little brother. If it saves one person, I think it's worth it. My childhood was pretty normal for the most part. I was a big brother, which I loved, and I was one of those rare big brothers that didn't pick on his younger sibling. Ryan, that was my brother, Ryan and I got along great. We played so many games together, walked to school together, stayed up late together, and even slept in the same bedroom. To say we were close would be an understatement. That's why it hurts even more than it should when everyone looks at me like it was my fault. It was a typical Friday night when it happened. Ryan and I were supposed to be asleep, but instead we were whispering and giggling in our beds. And that was the first night that we heard it. A scratching sound coming from under Ryan's bed. We froze, not daring to make a sound. But then the scratching turned into a rhythmic tapping, and we knew that something was definitely there. We looked at each other with wide eyes, and Ryan's first instinct as a little kid was to curl himself up in a ball under a pile of protective blankets. Neither of us dared to investigate, but we listened as if our lives depended on it, and for reasons we didn't yet understand, the noises stopped. Needless to say, we didn't get much sleep that night, or for many nights after. We slowly began to forget about that night and move on with our lives until about 2 months later when things started to get really bad. The night I saw it. It was just past bedtime. Ryan was definitely out at this point, and I was still in that weird spot between awake and sleeping, where you're not sure if what you're seeing is real or a dream. Just like that first night, it started with a scratching sound. It almost sounded like something was pulling itself across the hardwood floor by its nails, dragging its heavy body behind. I could distinctly hear the sound of fingernails hitting the wood. 1 hand, 2 hand, then drag. 1 hand, 2 hand, then drag. I wanted to curl up under my blankets, which seemed to work the first time, but for some reason, I didn't. I guess the protective big brother in me needed to understand what was happening so I could protect Ryan. By this time, the rhythmic tapping started, and I mustered up the courage to open my eyes, and what I saw would be burned into my brain till this very day. It definitely wasn't human. Its grotesque figure was illuminated by the moonlight coming through the window. It had horrible yellow eyes, and it was tapping on the side of the bed frame with one of its disgusting fingers, while the other was pointing at Ryan's foot that was peeking out from under the covers, hanging over the bedside. I could see its glistening eyes fixated on Ryan's toes, slowly counting its way down his foot in sync with the rhythmic tapping. My first instinct was to scream and throw my pillow at the creature, which immediately woke up Ryan, who recoiled in fear, pulling his whole body back under his covers, sending the toe-counting creature back under the bed. Ryan just stared at me, breathing heavily, not saying a word. I think he could tell by the look on my face that I saw something that terrified me, and I think he was afraid to ask. He immediately jumped down from his bed and into mine, curling up behind me. After what seemed like forever, he quietly asked me, "What did you see?" Maybe I should have lied to him. Maybe I should have protected him, but I thought he needed to know that there was some strange monster under his bed counting his toes. And I didn't want to find out what would happen if the creature finished counting, so I explained exactly what I saw. Little kids are so funny. He didn't even question it. He didn't try to think rationally about it. He just immediately believed his big brother's story and wanted to know what he could do to be safe. I could tell that this thing was focused on Ryan's foot that was left unprotected over the side of the bed. I think that's the key. If we both just made sure to keep our feet under our covers, we might be okay. It sounded simple. Just don't give this toe counter anything to count, and it can't harm us then, right? I wish it was that simple. Even though I was sure I understood what it wanted, it didn't really matter. How can anyone sleep at night knowing that there is actually a creature under the bed? Ryan didn't care about what it wanted or how to keep himself safe. Just knowing that it was real, accepting that monsters are real and that they can prey on you in the night was plenty to keep him from sleeping ever again. My parents started out being concerned, but after weeks of Ryan not sleeping, the concern started to turn into panic, and then the panic soon turned into anger. They seemed mad at us all the time. Ryan pleaded with my parents every night at bedtime and wouldn't get any sleep except for a few minutes here and there while my mom and dad would sit on the side of the bed with him. The second they would get up to leave, no matter how stealthy they tried to be, Ryan would freak out. It got to the point where nobody in our house was sleeping properly. This creature was now keeping us all awake. My parents hit their breaking points pretty quickly. They started asking me questions that made me feel like they believed it was my fault. They thought I was just being a crappy big brother and filling Ryan's head with nonsense and telling him scary stories just to torture him and keep him up all night. Now, you don't know me, and I have no way of proving that I'm not that kind of person. But my parents, they do know me. I couldn't believe they thought I would do something like that. I was only trying to protect my little brother and keep him safe. That's all I cared about. My relationship with my parents changed from that point on. It just got progressively worse and worse until they did something that would ultimately lead to Ryan's death. They had a psychiatrist prescribe a bunch of medications that would turn my little brother into what seemed like a zombie during the day and would knock him out cold at night. Now, I don't know if they were doing it because they thought it would help him or if they just needed a break themselves, but either way, I knew it would make my job protecting him that much harder. At this point, I don't know if it was the sleep deprivation I was struggling with or the constant fighting with my parents, but I began to question what I had seen that night. Did I actually see a monster, or could it have just been a dream like my parents believe? The very first night on his medication at about 3 o'clock in the morning, all my doubts would be wiped away when I heard the nails on the floor, followed by that same dragging sound. The hair stood up on the back of my neck, and I felt sick to my stomach. My parents almost convinced me I was crazy, but here it was, just like that first night. That grotesque creature was back. I sprang from under my covers to see those haunting eyes staring at my brother's uncovered foot. It began counting, so I threw my pillow at it, but nothing. It just hissed and kept counting. I guess this thing wasn't afraid of me. I would have to wake up Ryan so he can pull his leg back under the blanket. That's what worked the last time. So I jumped to his bed, barely touching the floor between, and tried to pull his foot from the monster's grip, but it was way too strong. The only hope was to wake up Ryan. The medication made this really tough, so I literally had to hit him with all my might, all over his body, until finally the pain was enough to break him free of his medicated sleep. He sat up, looked directly into the eyes of the monster, and tried to scream, but he was so scared that no real sound came out. Just a weird, hoarse-sounding cough. He pulled his foot back onto the bed, closing his eyes and burying his face into my chest. It worked. The toe counter didn't get him that night. Now that we were both convinced what was happening, we tried to explain it to our parents and to the doctors, but nobody believed us. My parents even started making me sleep in a spare room at night. It seemed like they were trying to keep me from Ryan, like this was somehow my fault. But if they medicate him and they won't let me in the room, what will happen if his feet slip out again? What if nobody's there to wake him? What happens when the toe counter finishes his counting? I guess we were lucky for the next few nights. Ryan was knocked out by his medication, but I guess his feet luckily never left the bed. But how many nights would we be this lucky? We both knew it was just a matter of time before it would be back, and my poor little brother didn't seem to have much hope left in him. We were only allowed to see each other for a small amount of time each day, doctor's orders, but every time we did, Ryan just seemed sad. I tried to make the time fun, but he just seemed to give up. I guess he accepted that at some point he would be vulnerable and that I wasn't in the room anymore to help. This next part gets a little gruesome, so bear with me. I understand if you don't want to hear the rest, but I think it's important that everyone knows the truth. Ryan wanted to take matters into our own hands. Forget our parents. Forget the doctors. He believed there was one and only one way to protect himself. I refused at first and said no for months, that I couldn't, that I wouldn't do it, but it's the only thing he would talk about on our short visits. He spent every second we were together begging me to help him, crying and pleading, until finally I gave in. Ryan had a plan, and he was convinced that there was only one way out. No toes to count, no toe counter. I waited until really late at night, when I knew both my parents would be asleep. I crept into the garage and got a battery-powered circular saw. My dad was so proud of that saw when he got it. He always said it was surprisingly powerful. I assumed that it should be able to cut through bone then. I snuck through the house and opened the door to my old room, hoping to wake my brother up and talk him out of this crazy plan. But that's not what happened. I slowly pushed the door open, and there it was. My timing was insane. Both of my brother's feet were exposed, and it was holding one foot with one hand and tapping on the bed frame with the other. It snarled as I entered the room, but never broke eye contact from its task. I jumped on the bed and tried to wake up Ryan. I hit and shook him, but nothing. His drug-induced sleep was way too powerful. The monster was so focused, it wasn't going to stop, and I did what my brother asked me to do. I only did what he begged me to do. I pulled the trigger on the saw and dropped it onto my brother's leg, just above the ankle. It went straight through the flesh so quickly, but almost stopped the second it hit the bone. It took a lot more force than I thought it would to cut through human bone. I couldn't believe what I was doing. I couldn't believe this was really happening. And I couldn't believe that despite my forceful and savage sawing, Ryan still wasn't waking up. Eventually I made it almost all the way through, and the combination of my sawing and the creature pulling created an audible and horrific snap. What was left of the bone had cracked and pulled away from the leg. Things happened so fast. I didn't really have time to think. I just reacted. The monster moved over to Ryan's other foot, and I knew I only had 5 seconds to finish that side as well. I plunged the rotating blade into his leg, but this time it was up closer to the knee. I didn't realize the bone was thicker up there. 5 seconds can sometimes feel like an eternity, but not that night. 5 seconds was not enough time to remove my brother's leg with my dad's stupid circular saw. The toe counter finished his count. Finally losing focus on my brother's foot, it looked me dead in the eyes and almost seemed to smirk. Then with some sort of unholy power and speed, and in one ripping motion, the creature pulled my brother under the bed, sending a spray of blood across the room, leaving me there alone as the night went silent. The media ignores that whole part of the story and likes to simply report starting from here. My parents, awakened by the sounds of the saw, ran into our room to find me, covered in blood, curled up beside my brother's severed foot. The rest of his body was gone. They asked me what happened, but what could I say? They begged me to tell them where Ryan was, and so did the cops when they got there, and so did the doctors. The honest truth is, I don't know where he is. I have no idea if he's still alive, and I have no idea how to find him. But I do know what took him. It's been a lot of years now, but I still can't sleep very well at night. I mean, who could after all of that? Every time I try, I have nightmares and I see those horrible yellow eyes of the toe counter counting its way down my foot. I don't know what to do, but I do know one thing. The toe counter is real, and it's out there, waiting to take anyone who sleeps with their feet hanging over the edge of the bed. So if you see a YouTuber trying to get their 15 minutes of fame with a video essay about me, or a news headline talking about the boy who mutilated his brother and hid the body, don't be so quick to judge. There may be parts to the story that you just couldn't or wouldn't want to understand.